Fishing vessel Grateful of Maritime Coastguard, we are reading you loud and clear.
Hello, I'm Julia Gosling and welcome to Seaview's podcast. And today we're talking about safety in the offshore oil and gas industry and offshore wind as well. As always, my co-host is Adam Parnell from Chirp.
Hello.
Hello, Adam. Welcome. And our guests today are Graham Skinner at Offshore Energies UK and also an old colleague of mine, Pete Lowson from the Maritime and Coastguard Agency. Hello.
Hello. Hi there.
Great. Could I introduce you first, Graham, to my listeners? Do you mind telling us a bit about OE UK and your role, just to kick us off?
Yes, absolutely. So OE UK evolves from Oil and Gas UK, which is the industry trade association for traditionally for oil, but we now represent wind members throughout the UK as well. And we're moving into other energy areas such as hydrogen, carbon capture and storage, and even geothermal. So we have 430 members, and they're based all around the UK. And our remit is really broad. So it's everything from advocacy for the industry right the way through to my role, which is health and safety. And even within health and safety, that's a very broad role, looking at everything from aviation safety through to offshore process safety and, of course, marine safety, which is why we're here today.
Yeah, great. Really good experience. And Pete, over to you. Can you tell me a bit about your role?
Yeah, of course. So I'm currently the head of operational procedures with His Majesty's Coast Guard, which has responsibility for aviation, coastal and maritime procedures, as well as offshore energy. But for the past 10 years, I've also been the offshore energy lead within the Coast Guard. And Coast Guard is part of the Maritime and Coastguard Agency, who are an executive agency within the Department for Transport, within government, and the Coast Guard specifically has responsibility for civil maritime search and rescue. And so I work within that remit very closely with the energy industries on search and rescue matters.
Yeah, great. I think we've got a good team assembled here to talk about offshore energy and safety. Let's kick right off then with, I think it would be great to know a little bit more about the size of this industry, because I think I read somewhere that this is a really big employer. I know it was years ago when it was at its peak for oil and gas, but any idea of the numbers now that are employed?
Yes, absolutely. The offshore marine environment is one of the most rapidly developing industrial landscapes in the UK. And we do see that proliferation of inshore and deeper offshore wind, along with established oil and gas structures. And we do see a future development in carbon capture and hydrogen, as I mentioned before. On top of that, we also have the interconnectors and pipelines that bring oil and gas from other countries, data cables, other marine operations. But within oil and gas itself, it still represents about 1% of British GDP and employs up to 10,000 people offshore on any given day. But that actually supports up to 200,000 jobs within the wider community within the UK. Comparing that to wind, they estimate about 40,000 direct and indirect jobs within wind. Combined, we're talking about 250,000 people employed in the offshore energy industries.
Yeah. It's a significant industry, isn't it, that's evolved. And looking at, question for both of you, really, looking at the safety record for UK offshore industry, it appears that it's a pretty good record that's improved over the years. Would you agree with that, Pete? Would that be your assessment as well, if I started with you?
Yeah, so looking at the search and rescue involvement in these incidents, we treat the industry as a maritime casualty, so we will come and support them if the need is there. They have their requirements to support themselves, and in most cases, the industry will respond to their own incidents. But the ones that we get involved in, that's been a fairly steady state for a number of years. They do fluctuate. They do fluctuate across the time of year and across years. But on the whole, they're relatively stable. Now it's fairly unsurprising that over time we will start to see oil and gas incidents and responses from a Coast Guard declining as that industry reduces. And on the flip side, we'll see the numbers of incidents and requirements for search and rescue to slowly increase within wind. But they're not big spikes, and generally that's a fairly stable picture.
Mm, mm. And Graham, are you fairly comfortable with that? It does seem like it's quite a good news story in terms of some other parts of maritime industry for safety.
Yeah, so it very much depends on what perspective you look at it from. So if you look at this last 60 years of oil and gas here, we could say that we have made unbelievable improvements in safety, and they've been really hard won as a result of quite serious incidents, and perhaps the most well-known was Piper Alpha, where 167 people lost their lives. But we've come a huge way from there. But we've had a more stable safety regime in the last 10 years. So if you look at the performance during that time, it's been a much more steady reduction in safety incidents and reflects that variability that Pete was talking about. If we look at something like a major hydrocarbon release, we've had just 3 in the last 5 years, whereas 10 years ago, we were averaging more than 5 a year. So we are continuing to see a reduction, and we're proud of that very hard-won safety lessons in oil and gas. And we're looking at how we can find opportunities to share those learnings into the wind sector and other renewable sectors as well. But they're not a cut and paste, so they're very much sector specific. So we have to find the best of both regimes and learn from each other. We have to be proactively vigilant when it comes to safety. So we're always looking to improve.
That's really interesting. That's a massive step change for the better. What do you think has led to that? Was it better routines? Was it better training? Was it technological innovation? I'd love to know a little bit more about that.
It's really everything. If I'm honest, Adam, we have changed the design of our installations to make them inherently safer. We've improved technology in vessels and in the equipment that we use. We train people more rigorously, and so all of these things have an impact and never stop. The fact that Offshore Energies UK has a health and safety department and environment department demonstrates that we are continuing to learn lessons and share good practice and do that continuous improvement.
And on top of that, as well, as you mentioned, the lessons, because there have been several very unfortunate incidents over the years, and now, thankfully, we see less major occurrences. Those lessons learned are really valuable. And I think through the painful lessons, but then also positive learning from exercising with industry, those collective learning, that sharing of learning through various engagement groups, industry forums, it makes a very positive difference.
That sharing that you mentioned clearly is what we in Chirp try to do about sharing lessons. So let's explore that for a bit, if you don't mind. How are these shared, both within the group and more widely? As you said there, you got these increasing linkages between offshore and then with wind industry. So and renewables. How are those lessons being shared across? Is it just within the members, or is it more widely?
So I think if I can come in on one point to start with and expand on this, there are several well-established groups of cross-industry regulator, emergency service members that are open to sharing their experiences quite shortly after incidents in a trusted environment, so that we can discuss some of those learnings. That's the best way I see things working, and that's been around in the oil and gas world not long after the Piper Alpha incident. One of the main groups that was set up and is facilitated by police, that's a very positive group. And then a similar group was established within the wind industry that does a very similar thing. And actually just recently, with a lot of support from OUK, we've established a new website which covers both those groups and a medical one as well. And that's a great way of building that engagement and sharing of lessons learned. And Graham may come up and talk about some more of the other groups that are around and how some safety bulletins and things are shared.
Yes, absolutely. I think one of the key aspects is that whether it's the MCA or the Health and Safety Executive or other regulators, there is a constant dialogue between the regulators and industry, and everyone is striving for the same outcome, which is improved safety. But we also, in addition to the great conversations we have within these work groups, we also try to capture those lessons pragmatically for the future by including them in good practice guidelines. And we're very much non-tribal. We'll work with anyone that is willing to work with us to develop guidance and publish it. So we work very closely with the Marine Safety Forum. We work closely with ERVA, which is the evacuation vessels that support our offshore installations, trade association, and a spin-off group called the Guidelines for Offshore Marine Operations, which is cross-country in the basin in the North Sea. So as we continue to update all of this guidance, it captures those lessons that we've learned and those experiences, and it allows other people to access them as well.
Mm. And Pete, I remember when I was working in the MCA in press office and comms, but there was some quite significant offshore industry exercises that used to get everyone together and do some real good lessons learned or understanding how things were going to work. That's still quite a significant part of the regime, is it, for safety?
It is, and we have different exercises from the different industries. So oil and gas has exercised a lot over the years, and we still involve ourselves in those exercises from a Coast Guard point of view. So we'll participate from our coordination centres and inject real communications into those exercises, and that's very important to capture the learning from that. We also have every 3 years the National Contingency Plan, which is part of the environmental response in the UK. Every 3 years the oil and gas industry is involved in a big exercise to test that national level plan, which again is another way of testing something you hope won't happen, but it brings all the various organisations and individuals together. And then about 3 or 4 years ago, through the renewables group, we put together a triennial renewables exercise. So it's a big renewables exercise every 3 years. And the next one will be in next month up in the north of Scotland. And that's a very good multi-agency exercise with offshore and onshore support. So the industry is very keen at supporting through training and exercising, and that is a big part of improved safety.
Yeah, and everybody gets to know what the processes are and who you're going to work with in an actual incident, which is actually very useful, isn't it, in advance of anything ever happening?
Indeed, and it's nice in these larger exercises when you do involve everybody, and the industry in particular is very proactive at exercising their offshore teams, whether that's in a command and control setting, whether that's using the rescue equipment, and then separate to that, testing some of their onshore response setup. But not often do you get all of it together right up through the various levels up to a sort of national emergency service government level, and that's what these large scale exercises can test and practice.
Yes. I wonder if we could talk about the significant, or if there are any significant differences between oil and gas industry and then renewables. Is it just that they're operating in different areas, or are they significantly different risks? How is that playing out?
Yeah. The harsh environment of the North Sea is common across all industries that operate within it. It's remote, and there's a real requirement to be self-sufficient in terms of your response to any emergencies. However, the different sectors do have fundamentally different risks. For example, oil and gas, there is a significant risk of fire and explosion, which can escalate to potentially the full loss of an offshore installation, although we really hope that would never occur. Whereas in offshore wind, they have different challenges because their work sites are often spread over a large geographical footprint. So they have a very distributed workforce. So perhaps one of the most interesting areas of safe practice is that isometric learning, that cross-sector learning. And that's always a two-way conversation. How can we pick the best and most effective aspects of each other's experience and the processes and adopt them in a way which is appropriate for each of the sectors?
And it's the Seafarers Charity do fund this podcast, and so there are a lot of actual seafarers who are transporting people, or they are working offshore. There's all of the supply vessels and so forth. That is quite a lot and tugs, of course. That is quite a significant number of people as well, isn't it, being managed in this industry?
Yes, and for many of those seafarers, they will work in both industries and won't really notice a significant change between them, whether they're delivering supplies to an offshore substation that's part of a wind development or going to an offshore installation. That is all common.
I'm always interested to hear, like, they seem to operate in a really good state of readiness. Often it's supply vessels and offshore vessels that are responding to other maritime emergencies, aren't they? We saw that recently, didn't we, with that incident in the North Sea with really fast response.
Yeah, and it's nice to see some of those teams from that incident getting recognised in some local Northeast awards just recently. So that is a massive support. And one of the roles that I have in the day job is to ensure that new wind farms are built in a way that limits the impact to seafarers and that navigation risk is as low as possible, and that their ability to provide a search and rescue service is maintained. However, the industry also brings with it a lot of support to the UK as a whole. So the likes of these vessels that can respond, aircraft that support, whether that's communications or fuel or medical supplies, that there's a whole host of resource that the industry brings that, yes, they might well become a casualty or be that casualty in an unfortunate incident, but actually they bring a lot of support to the emergency services, which is very much appreciated. And coming back briefly to your differences question in the industry, in many cases those differences are narrowing, and Graham rightly pointed out that hydrocarbon explosion risk isn't going to change. That's very different, but particularly in construction, you've got heavy lift barges and installations working within wind. You're now seeing floating wind becoming more of a factor, which is bringing installations in parts of the country that we wouldn't have seen them before. You're seeing wind farms proposed to electrify oil and gas installations, so there's that crossover there as well. And all of that brings the industries closer together, and that is important from a safety point of view, that the lessons are learned. And where the oil and gas industry has had a lot of experience to fall back on, the wind industry is now coming on for 20 years old in the UK since the first offshore wind farms, and there's learning on both sides, and that's why it's good that these groups and the likes of Offshore Energy UK and so on work together to improve safety.
So you've both mentioned quite a few safety features there, like you said, design and training and all the exercising, all the lessons and the sharing of the lessons, and those all sound really good. But if we were to look slightly, well, not actually that far into the future ahead, with the UK's ambition for offshore renewables across all the sectors, especially in like the North Sea, that side of the UK. And you touched on it very briefly there, Pete, about safety and navigation. We're talking about a congested area anyway, in terms of shipping. I know that lots of fishing fleets and there's a lot of fishing grounds out there. So quite aside from just the simple planning and the logistics of where we put these things, and Graham, you mentioned about the interconnectors earlier, the amount of infrastructure that we're about to see being built out, and you talked about the construction risks. Could either of you just talk us through a little bit about that? And what would be the big risks? What would be the big issues to look for? And how are those likely to be tackled?
That's something that doesn't just impact the UK, but impacts Europe and it impacts much further afield as well. So from an MCA point of view, we work very closely with the likes of the Crown Estate and Crown Estate Scotland on very early leasing days to look at which parts of the seabeds are being discussed. For example, one potential area at one point was looking at one of the shallower water areas in the middle of the channel, which is clearly not a favourable place to put a wind farm. So it's having those early discussions and then working closely with the industry to make sure that they are designed in a way that limits the impact to shipping in particular. They then work very closely with the fishing industry to ensure that industry is best protected as much as we can. And also looking at in future, you mentioned future options, co-location. So that's where potentially some seaweed farms, which are a big thing upcoming, could potentially be co-located in the footprint of a wind farm. You've also found, and Graham might be able to speak more about this, but the likes of pipelines or cables often create little micro areas for fish and sea life. So actually you're finding that they improve the fish life in some circumstances. So it's about maximizing the potential that our wind and tide and waves can generate and traditional hydrocarbon industries, but still allowing safe passage of all our trade and fishing and leisure and all the other elements to go ahead.
That's really interesting. Graham, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so we've got a very interesting work stream underway at UK, and it's around coexistence and this challenge that we all have to coexist in the marine environment, and we need to be able to understand each other's requirements so that we can manage that effectively. For example, the requirements to fly helicopters to wind farms is very different for the reasons that we want to fly helicopters to oil and gas installations and the access, etc. But beginning to develop that understanding through conversations is the very essence of how we can begin to move this forward. Encroachment of wind developments on existing infrastructure is a challenge as well. But by working together to find equitable ways forward, then we can hopefully unlock the potential of offshore wind, but also retaining access to our oil and gas infrastructure, which the Committee for Climate Change acknowledges we're going to be using hydrocarbons up to 2050 and beyond. So it's very important for us that we also continue to have that homegrown energy as well. But we are already identifying risks where it's almost unintended consequences. So if you have a large wind farm with a gap through it for marine traffic, then that also then becomes the place that the cables get laid. And then subsequently, if vessels had to put down an anchor, for example, then you have that knock-on risk. I don't think we've solved that issue yet, but we're very much trying to develop those conversations so that we can be in a much more collaborative and place and coexist together.
I'm glad you mentioned cables, because I was going to come on to that just very briefly. Of course, all this offshore infrastructure and things we see in the news, especially around the Baltics and other parts of the world, in terms of cables being snagged, cut, whether deliberately or by a very large series of unfortunate accidents. And I'll leave that to the listener to decide which one that is. But that security aspect must surely be a headache for both of you.
Yes, and that's another area which is developing very fast, and we are all trying to keep up with that situation. We had a really interesting conference actually at OUK last week on security and looking at these challenges, and absolutely our infrastructure that is subsea, especially things like pipelines, interconnector cables that are over hundreds and hundreds of miles, are very difficult for us to monitor and secure all of the time. But actually, our marine community is also a fantastic set of eyes for that sort of thing. So our offshore energies community have been spotting suspicious drones and unusual vessels moving around, and getting that reported into the authorities is very important. But it's not just the sort of perhaps the more remote risk of hybrid warfare, but actually criminals are using the marine space much more than they used to, whether it's trafficking people or drugs. And these inshore structures such as wind farms are becoming much more of interest to criminal elements as well. So offshore security is very important at the moment.
And of course, I suppose it's very difficult for you to mitigate against this. But as we've mentioned, security, and you're looking after the infrastructure. We Chirp have received over the last couple of years, not many, but several reports of where transfer vessels, for example, support vessels have literally run into these things for various number of reasons. But it does just go to show the risks that there are out there of that congestion. And of course, I'm just going to move topics slightly. You've talked a lot about the increasing in technology that's happening in both the offshore and the oil and gas, and the offshore and the renewables sectors. But of course, that isn't happening in isolation, because actually for the maritime industry as a whole, there's a huge amount of revolutionary change, really, in terms of AI, autonomy, all these new technologies, new novel fuels. So I'm just wondering, like, how is that indirectly impacting on how you go about your business now, you look ahead? Because we are looking in the relatively near future to vessels which may have few or no crew, operating largely following an algorithm in quite a congested area. We talked about using still quite novel fuels in new ways, which in itself brings risks. So I'm just wondering how that whole gamut of risks is actually interrelating, and how that you're taking that into account.
So I think from a MCA point of view, we have quite a large team who are now working both on together and separately on autonomy and on future fuels, because they are linked but also separate risks, as you say. And when you look at whatever the future fuel might be that has some benefits, lots of benefits from an environmental point of view, then it can also bring some potential safety risks or just different risks that we need to have a way of addressing. So the MCA as a whole are looking at that in a lot of detail. From a Coast Guard point of view, an interesting thing that's been around for a little while, and it's now becoming much more of a current plan and certainly future, is remotely operated rescue craft. So craft that can potentially travel with lean crewed or no crew on board to rescue individuals. And also you mentioned AI, and actually bringing AI much more into search methodology. So if you have somebody or something missing at sea, you can use sensors and cameras with AI technology to search and track individuals in the water far quicker. So it's a much more efficient, much more reliable way than actually somebody physically looking out of a lifeboat or a helicopter to identify things. And if you combine those AI tools with rescue craft, with autonomous vessels, you begin to build a bit of an understanding of how remotely operated or autonomous vessels might be able to meet some of their safety of life at sea obligations in responding to other mariners in distress. And some of that then links into the offshore energy world with ability. So one of the risks for us, how do we access inside a wind farm to search and or rescue people? Some of this equipment, some of this technology can very much support with that. And it also potentially has security implications as well. And coming back to your last question, if you can put cameras, radar, sensors on wind farms or offshore installations, you begin to build a picture of what's happening with that. And if you can then interrogate that with with artificial intelligence or similar, that becomes quite a powerful tool against many of the challenges we face in future.
It's really interesting indeed. Graham, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I'm very excited about the opportunities that this new technology is going to present. I think we're in a great place in the UK with lots of companies developing some fantastic ideas, but also we've got a nice balance between the speed of development and also the, should we say, the pragmatic caution that our regulators have. We have been flying beyond line of visual sight drones, for example, for 8 years now to do methane inspection, and we've been able to develop enough data now that the Civil Aviation Authority will, from the end of this year, allow those drones to fly on a more regular basis, which unlocks a huge number of additional missions, and that's really exciting. Pete already talked about our ability to potentially identify and rescue people, and actually in the security space, or generally the integrity space, I was learning last week about how one of the interconnector companies is using AI to track the vessels that trawl over the top of their connectors, making sure that they avoid any damage that could have an impact on that cable. And with AI, they can not only identify the vessels from their beacons, but they can also fingerprint their noise of their engine, so they can actually identify them even if they turn off their AIS tracking. These are things which we just couldn't have done before we were able to access this large data in the way that we do. So I think it will present lots of additional opportunities, and if we can get a safety benefit from that as well, that'd be excellent.
Wow. Yeah, that's almost a dystopian future, isn't it? We're all being monitored by Big Brother somehow, but at the same time, it's providing safety. So it's I'm not sure how I feel about that. It's both good and yeah, terrifying at the same time.
While we're thinking about the future, we're going to have fossil fuels with us for some time. We know that. But climate change, that's the reason why countries are looking at reducing their fossil fuel use. Climate change is already happening. We got potentially different weather already. Is this something you've got to think about? Is this a risk on the radar, as it were?
Yes, absolutely. Now, it's important to make clear that offshore energies are really committed to the energy transition, and we really want to see this happen. And personally, as a father, I want to see that as well. It's very important. We do already see the effects of extreme weather, where we're seeing a lot more energetic and a lot more frequent severe storms, for example. Although not all bad weather is the cause of climate change either. We do have a sort of meteorological cycle where you have worse winters and better winters. We can't always demonstrate that climate change is related to these things. But yes, we have had some challenging winters actually, and perhaps Pete might speak to that. But 23 and 24, there was quite a few storms that rolled through that were not just a challenge in the offshore marine environment, but also for all of the families that are at home and living onshore as well. We are looking at severe weather action plans for installations so that, if necessary, certain installations can be effectively evacuated prior to a very big storm coming through. And the sort of margins of safety we have is for 1 in a 10,000 year storm. We think these are very unlikely to happen during the time that the industry is out there, but we're always prepared for the worst to make sure that we can get people home safely.
Many of the energy vessels that will respond can head for port when a storm is inbound. Those on-us installations, other than what Graham's mentioned in terms of that proactive reduction in personnel, are somewhat limited with their ability to come back if there's a storm inbound. But the work industry has done to address that is very good, and there's some the plans that are in place are effective. From a Coast Guard point of view, we can and have supported in incidents that have had potential impacts, because we don't want to see anybody left in a place they might be at risk, so we can respond in an emergency situation to bring these people back. But it's a case of, as I say, working together and monitoring the forecast, understanding what resources are available, and ensuring that everybody is in a safe place even when these storms hit. But as Graham touched on there, we've had several fairly sizable storms over a relatively recent period, nothing to the scale that the worst that will have a big impact, and these installations are designed to deal with them very well. And it's only if that very exceptional weather comes through that you might look at that being a worse scenario.
And what about the future for oil and gas in the North Sea? If we're going to see a lot more decommissioning and it's a transition period, does that have its own impact? Does that mean that there's potential for, I don't know, less profit and potentially less of a quality safety regime? I'm just playing devil's advocate here.
So it's always a concern. The safety is an expensive business, and to do it well, to have your equipment and everything is expensive. But it's always been clear that for companies to operate in the North Sea, they need to abide by the law and they need to comply with good practice. And that's how they demonstrate that compliance with the law. we wouldn't expect to see a decline in safety as a direct result of the current financial situation or as installations move towards decommissioning. But there is certainly a challenge in terms of saying how can we do things differently and can we do things more efficiently, and actually evolving with the environment, and things that we did that were really important 30 years ago might not need to be continued today, and we might find other ways of doing things. And we already touched on things like AI as a way of unlocking efficiencies and whatnot as well. We are currently undergoing a consultation with government around the future of the North Sea, so it very much is a political decision to decide how much longer we continue with operations out there and how quickly we make the energy transition.
And I think the similar sort of face the up and coming industries as well, with like renewables, because of supply chain concerns, materials, taxes, all the other things that are on the rise. That does make it an expensive industry to finance, and therefore there have been some well publicised reports of late of developers pulling out of projects and so on because of rising costs. But as Graham says, that can't be at the cost of safety. And ultimately, if organisations build a good safety regime into their project from the start, a safe workforce is an efficient one, and that's always going to win over anything else.
Yeah, and there's that slight cliche, isn't it? Which is if you think safety is expensive, try having an accident.
Yeah.
But no, you're right. These things are very expensive. At the end of the day, it's the logistics of the whole thing, isn't it? Trying to do something in a harsh environment that isn't particularly easy to construct or work or live in, it does make it very difficult. But let's just turn briefly, perhaps, to the individual seafarers, the maritime workers that are all involved in this industry. We've talked about a lot of change, either happening now or coming down the track, and lots of changes in the industry. So what support can we as a sector give to people who are in this industry or thinking of joining this industry to help them best transition through all these changes?
Yeah, so I think it's a hugely exciting time to join the offshore energy industry. I think you can join and go into oil and gas and develop incredible experience and then move into wind in 5 or 10 years' time. It's a harder sell for younger people. I think I do understand that sort of challenge, but I think the wind industry is incredibly exciting as well. I was fortunate enough to travel by helicopter out to Hornsea 2 and see how they winch technicians down onto the tops of these huge turbines, larger than the Eiffel Tower, to go and do repairs and pick them up again at the end of the day. And that is fundamentally a cool job to have. But yeah, how do we enable the workforce? That's one of the areas that we UK are doing a lot of work with. We're looking at a skills passport so that individuals can take their skills from one industry to another. And actually, we see the workforce moving to wind and back again for a lot of our supply chain, whether it's fixing gearboxes or doing electrical work, installing fire and safety systems. We already have quite a transient workforce, but we need to continue that. And then there's other areas such as the offshore medical, which I think is very important for offshore workers' health. We have one in oil and gas, and we're just about to launch one in collaboration with the Energy Institute and G+ in the UK for wind workers as well. That's a great area of collaboration, and an area which, again, hopefully that will ultimately allow workers to go for a single medical, regardless of which sector they're going to work in down the line. Lots of positives, but it's not always easy. It's not always been easy to get agreement, and I think the more we learn about each other from both sides and both sectors, the more common ground we're finding. But there's been false starts, and there's been difficult discussions. I think we just need to continue to put all our energy behind trying to move all of these cross-sector projects together.
Fascinating.
So, Pete, I always let my guests have one last question, and I do like to know if there was anything you could change. If you could make one change for maritime safety, what would it be?
It's a really good question, and it's something that I could likely come up with a number of different answers on slightly different topics. But the one that does stand out for me, and it's something we've actually touched on throughout the episode, is around exercising training and exercising, but particularly exercising. And it's something that the industries have been very good at, but I would love to see more of it and more support from across a project, across a whole organization to get involved and to really invest in the value of your people getting exposed to real life examples, challenging examples that test you regularly. And if you just look at some of the other regulated industries, like the aviation industry, for example, they're regularly training and exercising. And while the industry does that well, I would like to see that done in a wider and more involved manner, having
Brilliant.
projects and organizations getting deeply invested in that.
Excellent. Okay, Graham, you get the same privilege. What's your one change for maritime safety?
For me, I really don't think that there's one big change out there that's going to make a fundamental difference, if I'm honest. I think
Well, you
the biggest
can't shoehorn in 5, I'm afraid.
I think the biggest impact we can have is to continue to try and do it all, because actually the expectations we have for safe operations, the reading the procedures before you do the job and preparing for the job properly and executing it and remembering to stop and make sure that you're still on track, keeping a track of the conditions, making sure that you're keeping watch. All of these things are particularly challenging at the moment. There's distractions, there's everyone's busier than ever, and we're working in more complex environments. So I really think that looking at operational integrity and operational excellence is really the way forward. So that really is around doing it all and trying to do it all well. And those will result in incremental changes that will have a fundamental impact on the safety outcomes.
Okay, great. Thanks. That's really interesting to get those answers, different perspectives.
I love that's one of the great things about this podcast is we meet a great range of people and we have some really interesting conversations. So thank you very much.
So that's the end of our Seabreeze podcast. And after a fairly calm ride out in the North Sea today, we're leaving the bridge and heading back to shore now.
Fishing vessel Great Falls, Maritime Coastguard, we are reading you out and clear.